"Keep the change," Gabriel sneered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that demanded absolute submission. He tossed a single, crumpled $1 bill onto the sticky Formica table, the faded portrait of George Washington immediately soaking up a puddle of spilled black coffee. It was an insult, a calculated, deliberate humiliation meant to remind her that in this dark, unforgiving city, he was an untouchable king, and she was nothing more than the dirt beneath his custom-tailored Italian leather shoes. But as the diner door swung shut behind his imposing frame, Natalie didn't cry. She didn't cower. She picked up the sodden bill, her knuckles turning bone white. Breathing heavily, she burst through the swinging diner doors into the freezing rain, determined to prove that her dignity was not for sale. The neon sign outside the Starlight Diner flickered with a persistent, annoying hum, casting a sickly, intermittent red glow across the rain-slicked pavement. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the hour when the city's underbelly crawled out from the shadows to seek refuge in cheap coffee and greasy food. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old frying oil, scorched percolator coffee, and the stale despair of the graveyard shift. Natalie stood behind the scratched linoleum counter, a damp rag clutched in her right hand, her shoulders aching with the familiar grinding exhaustion that had become the background music of her life. She was 24, but the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights caught the faint, premature lines of worry etched around her deep brown eyes. Her uniform, a faded blue dress with a white apron, felt heavy, clinging to her tired frame. She wiped down the counter mechanically, her mind drifting to the stack of past-due medical bills sitting on her cramped kitchen table back home. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed, a sharp, innocent sound that starkly contrasted with the sudden, suffocating shift in the diner's atmosphere. The ambient noise, the clatter of silverware, the low hum of conversation from the 3 truckers in the corner booth, the sizzling of bacon on the grill vanished instantly. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Natalie looked up from the counter, her rag freezing in mid-circle. He walked in like he owned the building, the street outside, and the very air they were all breathing. Gabriel, even those who didn't know his face, knew the aura of pure, unadulterated danger that radiated from him. He was dressed in a midnight black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the fabric absorbing the harsh diner light rather than reflecting it. His dark hair was slicked back, his jawline sharp and unyielding, and his eyes, a piercing, cold shade of gray, swept the room with the casual disdain of a predator surveying a field of mice. He wasn't alone. 2 men, built like brick walls and wearing poorly concealed shoulder holsters beneath their heavy trench coats, flanked him. They moved in perfect, terrifying synchronization with their boss. The truckers in the corner abruptly stopped eating. One by one, they threw crumpled bills onto their table, kept their heads down, and scurried out the side exit, desperate to avoid making eye contact. Within 60 seconds, the Starlight Diner was empty of customers, leaving only Natalie, the terrified line cook hiding in the back, and Gabriel's trio. Gabriel chose the center booth, sliding into the red vinyl seat with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't look at a menu. He simply stared at the counter, waiting. Natalie swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat feeling like sandpaper. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but years of surviving in a rough neighborhood had taught her one ironclad rule: never show fear to a dog that's ready to bite. She grabbed a fresh order pad, pulled a pen from her apron pocket, and walked around the counter. Her steps were measured, forcing a calm she absolutely did not feel. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremors shaking her hands. Gabriel didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, a power play designed to make her squirm. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her frayed name tag, the cheap fabric of her apron, the exhausted droop of her shoulders. It was a look that stripped away her humanity, reducing her to an object, a servant, an insect. "Coffee," he finally said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the empty diner, vibrating with an unsettling authority. "Black, and a steak. Rare. If it's cooked a second past blue, you'll be eating it. We're a diner, sir. We have skirt steak," Natalie replied, maintaining eye contact. "It won't be what you're used to." One of the bodyguards shifted his weight, his hand twitching toward his coat. Gabriel raised a single gloved finger, stopping the man instantly. A microscopic smirk played at the corner of his lips. He was amused by her pushback. "Just bring it." Natalie turned on her heel and walked back to the kitchen, her spine stiff. The next 20 minutes were an agonizing exercise in tension. She poured his coffee, her hand remarkably steady as she set the thick ceramic mug before him. He didn't thank her. When she brought the plate, the best cut the terrified cook could manage, seared exactly as requested. Gabriel ate in silence, his eyes never leaving her, as she busied herself behind the counter. He was studying her, looking for a crack in her composure. When he finally finished, he motioned for the check with a flick of his wrist. Natalie calculated the total, ripped the pale green slip from her pad, and placed it face down on his table. $14.50, she stated clearly. Gabriel reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, black leather money clip holding a stack of crisp, perfectly aligned $100 bills. It was more money than Natalie made in a grueling, back-breaking month. He peeled off a single $100 and let it flutter onto the table. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled, worn-out $1 bill. He placed the $100 in the center of the table to cover the meal. Then, he placed the crumpled dollar bill directly on top of the spilled coffee ring near the edge. He stood up, towering over her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a chilling, predatory gleam. "Keep the change," Gabriel sneered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that demanded absolute submission. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. It was a calculated humiliation, a demonstration of his absolute superiority. He turned and walked toward the door, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. The bell chimed again, and they were gone, swallowed by the rainy night, leaving Natalie alone with the silence, the dirty plates, and the soaking wet dollar bill that felt heavier than an anvil. The diner was suffocatingly quiet, save for the relentless drumming of the rain against the large front windows. Natalie stood frozen at the edge of the booth, staring down at the soggy, stained dollar bill. George Washington's face was warping under the dark pool of cheap coffee. It was just $1. In the grand scheme of her chaotic, debt-ridden life, it meant absolutely nothing. But in that specific, agonizing moment, it meant everything. A hot, searing wave of heat rose from her chest, flushing her cheeks and burning behind her eyes. It was a profound, deeply rooted anger, not just at Gabriel, but at the entire cruel architecture of a world that allowed men like him to treat women like her as disposable trash. For months, she had bowed her head. She had smiled at rude customers, swallowed insults from her manager, and endured the terrifying threats of the loan sharks who hounded her for her mother's medical debts. She had shrunk herself to survive. But looking at that dollar bill, something inside Natalie snapped. A fragile, invisible wire that had been holding her immense pressure in check finally gave way. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the guns hidden under the bodyguards' coats, or the story she had heard about Gabriel's syndicate leaving people in the bottom of the river. She reached out, her fingers trembling with pure adrenaline, and snatched the wet bill from the table. It tore slightly at the corner, the paper mushy and foul-smelling. She squeezed it in her fist, feeling the dirty water drip down her knuckles. "No," she whispered to the empty room. Then she moved. Natalie practically vaulted over the counter, her worn, slip-resistant shoes squeaking loudly against the linoleum. She burst through the heavy front doors, the bell jingling wildly above her head. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The rain was coming down in sheets, a freezing, blinding torrent that instantly soaked through her thin cotton uniform. The wind howled through the concrete canyon of the city street, whipping her hair across her face. Down the block, Gabriel and his men were just reaching a massive, idling black SUV. The streetlights reflected off the polished hood, illuminating the heavy droplets of rain. The bodyguard on the right reached out to open the rear passenger door for his boss. "Hey!" Natalie screamed. Her voice was raw, tearing through her throat, battling the noise of the storm. "Hey!" Gabriel paused. He didn't flinch or look surprised. He turned slowly, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. The two bodyguards instantly pivoted, their hands diving inside their coats, their bodies dropping into defensive stances. Natalie didn't slow down. She ran down the sidewalk, her shoes splashing heavily in the deep puddles, her breath coming in ragged, visible gasps of white mist. She closed the distance, her eyes locked onto Gabriel's. The rain plastered her uniform to her skin, and she was shivering uncontrollably, but the fire in her eyes was hot enough to burn through steel. She reached the vehicle just as the larger bodyguard stepped forward, raising a massive hand to shove her back. "Back off, lady!" he barked, his voice menacing. Natalie didn't even acknowledge him. She ducked beneath his outstretched arm with a surprising agility born of pure, desperate rage. She stopped less than 2 feet from Gabriel. Up close, the sheer size of the man was overwhelming, but she refused to look down. She tilted her chin up, meeting his cold gray eyes without a single blink. The silence between them seemed to stretch for an eternity. Thick and electric, entirely separate from the chaotic storm raging around them. Gabriel looked at her, his head tilted a fraction of an inch to the side. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, confusion, curiosity. He was a man who lived his entire life insulated by fear. People ran away from him. They begged. They cowered. No one, absolutely no one, ran toward him in the pouring rain. Natalie raised her clenched fist. Her hand was shaking violently, but her grip was like iron. She slowly opened her fingers, revealing the ruined, coffee-stained dollar bill resting on her palm. "You made a mistake," Natalie said. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming force of her anger. She took one step closer, invading his personal space, smelling the expensive cologne and wet wool of his suit. She didn't hand it to him. She didn't drop it. She reached out and aggressively slapped the wet dollar bill flat against the center of his immaculate, custom-tailored chest. The damp paper clung to the expensive dark fabric, leaving a murky brown stain. "I serve food," Natalie said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain like a serrated knife. "I don't serve my dignity on a platter for you to step on. You need this dollar more than I do, because you are completely bankrupt inside." The bodyguards lunged forward, their faces twisted in fury at the disrespect shown to their boss. "You stupid bee," one of them snarled, his hand gripping the butt of his weapon. "Stop," Gabriel commanded. The single word was spoken softly, almost a whisper, but it carried absolute, terrifying authority. The bodyguards froze instantly, stepping back but remaining coiled like springs. Gabriel looked down at the ruined dollar bill clinging to his chest, then back up at the soaked, shivering waitress standing defiantly before him. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. The absolute lack of a violent reaction was somehow more terrifying than if he had drawn a gun. He slowly reached up with a leather-gloved hand, and peeled the wet dollar off his suit. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long, silent moment. The sneer was gone. "Go back inside," he said quietly, "before you catch your death." Natalie held his gaze for one more second, refusing to be the first to look away. Then she turned her back on the most dangerous man in the city and walked away. She didn't run. She walked with deliberate, agonizingly slow steps back toward the neon glow of the diner, leaving Gabriel standing in the pouring rain, holding a crumpled piece of trash. The penthouse suite of the Obsidian Tower was a fortress of glass, steel, and suffocating silence, high above the city's grime. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock in the corner of Gabriel's sprawling office. The room smelled of old leather, expensive scotch, and power. Gabriel sat behind a massive, dark mahogany desk, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a kingdom of glittering jewels. But his eyes were not on the empire he ruled. His gaze was entirely focused on the center of his immaculate leather desk blotter. There, perfectly flattened and dried, sat the stained, wrinkled $1 bill. For 3 days, it had sat there. It was a chaotic anomaly in an otherwise perfectly ordered world. Gabriel was a man of meticulous control. He had built his syndicate from the bloody streets up through sheer, terrifying calculation. He understood the mathematics of fear. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to a politician, exactly how much pain to inflict on a rival, exactly how to buy loyalty when loyalty couldn't be beaten into a man. Everything in his life was a transaction, an equation with a predictable outcome. But the waitress, Natalie, she was a variable he couldn't solve. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He closed his eyes, and the scene replayed in his mind with hyper-realistic clarity. The freezing rain, the smell of cheap coffee, the way her thin frame had shaken violently from the cold. Yet her eyes had burned with an intensity that rivaled a supernova. "You need this dollar more than I do, because you are completely bankrupt inside." The words had echoed in his head relentlessly. Men had been tortured for days without daring to speak to him with a fraction of that disrespect. He had killed men for looking at him with the wrong kind of shadow in their eyes. Yet, when she had slapped that wet paper against his chest, he hadn't felt the familiar, cold surge of homicidal rage. He had felt something entirely foreign. Profound, staggering shock, followed by an undeniable, infuriating spark of respect. A soft knock broke the silence. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Marcus, Gabriel's most trusted lieutenant, stepped into the cavernous room. Marcus was a man carved from granite, a pragmatist who handled the brutal day-to-day operations of the syndicate. "You asked for the file, boss," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. He approached the desk and laid a thin manila folder beside the dried dollar bill. He glanced at the ragged piece of currency, his brow furrowing slightly. But he knew better than to ask. Gabriel set his glass down and opened the folder. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as his eyes scanned the printed pages. He demanded comprehensive intelligence on his enemies. He hadn't expected the dossier of a late-night diner waitress to be so profoundly depressing. Natalie Hayes, age 24. No criminal record. Clean credit history until 18 months ago. Gabriel flipped the page. The bank statements and medical records told a brutal, silent story. Her mother, Marcus supplied, anticipating the question, diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 leukemia a year and a half ago, passed away 3 months ago. The treatments wiped out what little savings they had. The girl dropped out of community college to work full-time to pay for the care. She's drowning, Gabriel. 2 jobs. The diner at night, a laundromat during the day. She sleeps maybe 4 hours, but it's not enough. Not even close. Gabriel's jaw tightened. The debt, Medical bills are one thing, Marcus sighed, crossing his arms. But she got desperate toward the end. Needed money for an experimental trial that insurance wouldn't cover. She took a loan from one of Sal's guys. Gabriel's eyes snapped up, freezing on Marcus. Sal was a mid-level loan shark who operated under Gabriel's umbrella. He was a vicious, uncreative thug who specialized in squeezing blood from stones in the poorer district. "How much?" Gabriel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. 20 grand principal. But with Sal's street interest, she owes close to 40 now. He's been sending his dogs around to her apartment, giving her warnings. She has until the end of the week before they start breaking bones, or worse. Given her financial profile, she doesn't have a prayer of making the payment. Gabriel looked back down at the file, then slowly shifted his gaze to the dollar bill. The picture was complete, and it made the memory of the rain-slicked street even more staggering. She was a woman standing on the absolute edge of a cliff, carrying a crushing weight of grief and debt, staring down the barrel of violent loan sharks. She had absolutely nothing left to lose, except her life. And yet, when offered $100 that could have bought her groceries for a month, she had chosen to defend her pride over a crumpled $1 tip. She had risked her life, standing up to the apex predator of the city, simply because he had insulted her dignity. She wasn't stupid. She was unbroken. "Sal," Gabriel murmured, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He suddenly felt a sickening revulsion toward his own organization. He built empires. Sal shattered the kneecaps of desperate, grieving daughters. "Do you want me to have Sal back off?" Marcus asked, watching his boss carefully. He had never seen Gabriel take an interest in a civilian, let alone a debtor. Gabriel closed the folder slowly, his mind racing through calculations. If he simply paid her debt, she would hate him. She had made it abundantly clear that she didn't want his money or his charity. If he ordered Sal to forgive the debt, it would show weakness in the ranks, a disruption of the established order over a girl. "No," Gabriel said finally, his voice returning to its normal, icy calm. He picked up the dried dollar bill and slipped it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "Tell Sal to proceed exactly as he normally would. Let him make his move." Marcus frowned, confused. "Boss, if Sal's guys get their hands on her, they won't," Gabriel interrupted, standing up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes fixed on the city lights below, a dark plan forming in his mind. "Because I will be there." The Starlight Diner in the late afternoon was a different beast than in the dead of night. The harsh neon glow was replaced by the dusty, slanted rays of the setting sun cutting through the grease-streaked windows. The crowd was louder, tired construction workers, exhausted office staff grabbing a quick bite before the commute home, and teenagers occupying the booths with sodas they nursed for hours. Natalie was moving at a frantic pace. Her hair, usually tied back neatly, had loose strands sticking to the sweat on her forehead. She was balancing 3 plates of meatloaf on one arm, while pouring a refill of iced tea with her free hand. She was running on purely fumes, the exhaustion in her bones vibrating at a frequency that felt like physical pain. But the frantic pace kept her mind off the looming deadline. 48 hours. That's what Sal's men had told her when they cornered her in the hallway of her apartment building that morning. 48 hours, or they would start taking pieces of her. She swung past the register, dropping off a ticket, when the bell above the door chimed. It was a normal sound, but Natalie's instincts, honed razor-sharp by recent trauma, screamed at her. The ambient noise of the diner didn't vanish this time, but the atmosphere near the entrance thickened. She turned, a forced customer service smile halfway formed on her lips, and froze. Gabriel was standing just inside the doorway. This time, he wasn't flanked by his giant enforcers. He was alone. He wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored to lethal perfection, completely out of place against the backdrop of cracked vinyl and faded formica. The afternoon sun hit his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the terrifying, calm intensity in his gray eyes. He didn't survey the room. His gaze locked onto her the second he walked in. Panic, hot and suffocating, spiked in Natalie's chest. He's back. He's going to kill me for what I did. She instinctively took a half step backward, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the metal edge of the counter. Gabriel didn't approach aggressively. He walked with a measured, predatory slowness, making his way to the only empty stool at the far end of the counter, Natalie's assigned section. He sat down, placed his large hands flat on the counter, and waited. Natalie took a deep breath, forcing the trembling out of her limbs. She couldn't run. She had nowhere to go. She grabbed a damp rag and a fresh pot of coffee, walking down the length of the counter until she stood directly across from him. She didn't speak. She just wiped the surface in front of him, keeping the barrier between them. "The meatloaf smells burnt," Gabriel said casually, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Then I suggest you order the chicken, sir," Natalie replied, keeping her eyes focused on her hands. Her voice was steady, a desperate facade of bravery. Gabriel heard thad, circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers as she finally looked up to pour his coffee. He remembered the file. He knew exactly the hell she was living in. Yet here she was, standing her ground against a man who could end her life with a phone call. "I didn't come for the food, Natalie," he said. Hearing him say her name sent a cold shock down her spine. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything about you," Gabriel stated plainly. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. "I know about your mother. I know about the 2 jobs. And I know about the $40,000 you owe to a man named Sal." Natalie stopped pouring. The coffee overflowed the mug, spilling hot brown liquid over the saucer and onto the counter, burning her fingers. She gasped, dropping the pot with a clatter, and grabbed a napkin to mop it up, her mind spinning wildly. "Did you come here to gloat?" she hissed, leaning in close, her anger briefly overriding her terror. "Or did Sal send his boss to collect personally? Because if you're here for money, you're wasting your time. You can kill me right here, but I don't have it." Gabriel didn't move as the hot coffee pooled near his sleeve. He just looked at her, his expression softening by an imperceptible fraction. "I'm not here to collect, Natalie, and I am not going to hurt you. I came to ask you a question." Natalie paused, the wet napkin clutched in her hand. She stared at him, bewildered by the lack of malice in his voice. "What question?" Gabriel reached into his breast pocket. Slowly, he withdrew the crumpled, coffee-stained $1 bill. It was flattened out now, but the dark stain still marred the center. He placed it gently on the dry side of the counter between them. "Why?" he asked. His voice was intense, demanding an honest answer. "You are drowning in debt. You are terrified. You have every reason in the world to swallow your pride and take whatever money is thrown at you. $100 was on that table. Why did you chase me into the rain to give this back?" Natalie stared at the dollar bill, then up at Gabriel. The sheer arrogance of the question infuriated her. He lived in a world where everything had a price tag, where dignity was just a commodity to be bought and sold. "Because if I took it, then I'm exactly what you think I am," she said, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "If I took your $100, then that dollar bill wasn't an insult. It was my price. My mother raised me to believe that the only thing you truly own in this world is your self-respect. You can take my apartment. Sal can break my legs. But nobody gets to buy my dignity. Not for $100 and not for $1 million. She grabbed the dollar bill from the counter, walked over to the trash can, and threw it in. "I'm working," Natalie said, turning her back on him to grab the coffee pot. "Drink your coffee or leave," Gabriel sat in silence for a long time. He watched her work, watching the furious, exhausted, unbreakable spirit of the woman behind the counter. For the first time in his adult life, the mafia boss felt small. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp, uncreased $100 bill, and slid it under the edge of his saucer. It wasn't an insult this time. It was an apology. He stood up and walked out of the diner without looking back, knowing perfectly well that she would throw that bill in the trash too. The hallway leading to Natalie's apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and damp rot. The flickering fluorescent tube overhead buzzed like an angry hornet, casting strobe-like shadows across the peeling wallpaper. It was nearly 3 a.m. Her shift at the diner had ended an hour ago, but her feet felt like lead weights encased in concrete. As she trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, she fumbled with her keys, her vision blurring at the edges from sheer exhaustion. All she wanted was to fall onto her sagging mattress and sleep for 100 years, escaping the relentless pressure cooker her life had become. She slid the key into the deadbolt and turned it. It didn't catch. Natalie froze. The door was already unlocked. The frame around the lock was splintered. The cheap wood cracked. Her breath hitched in her throat. Every survival instinct screamed at her to turn around and run back down the stairs, out into the street. But this was her home. Everything she had left in the world, her mother's photographs, her meager savings, her sanctuary was inside. Slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she pushed the door open. The apartment had been destroyed. It wasn't just a search. It was a deliberate, violent message. The small sofa had been slashed, its cheap foam stuffing spilling out like guts. The small television was smashed on the floor. The drawers of her dresser had been pulled out and dumped, her clothes scattered and trampled. But the worst part was the kitchen. The small, fragile urn holding her mother's ashes, which normally sat on the windowsill, had been knocked to the linoleum floor. The lid was off, a small mound of grey ash dusting the cheap tiles. Natalie let out a choked, devastated sob. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the glass from a broken water glass, and frantically began trying to scoop the ashes back into the urn with her bare hands. Tears blinded her, hot and fast, mixing with the dust. It's a shame, really. Place was a dump anyway, but still a shame. Natalie gasped, spinning around. Sitting in the shadows of the corner, leaning back in her only intact kitchen chair, was a man. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating a pockmarked face, a broken nose, and cold, dead eyes. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. 2 other massive men stepped out from the darkness of her bedroom hallway, blocking her only exit. It was Sal's men, the collector. They called him the dentist on the streets, a nickname Natalie desperately didn't want to understand. "You missed your payment yesterday, Natalie," the man said, his voice a sickeningly sweet drawl. He stood up, towering over her as she knelt on the floor. He casually ground the heel of his boot into a photograph of her mother that had fallen from the wall. "I told you," Natalie pleaded, her voice cracking. "I told you I need more time. I'm working double shifts. I just need another week. I can get you $2,000 by Friday." The man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "$2,000? Sweetheart, the interest alone this week is $3,000. You're moving backward. Sal is losing his patience. He feels like you aren't taking your obligations seriously." "I am," she cried, scrambling backward as the man took a step forward. "I swear I am." "Sal doesn't want your sweat, Natalie. He wants his money, or he wants collateral." The man crouched down, suddenly grabbing her by the jaw with a vicious, bruising grip. His fingers dug into her cheeks, forcing her to look into his dead eyes. He smelled of stale smoke and cheap mints. "You're a pretty girl, tired, but pretty. There are places Sal knows where a girl like you can work off 40 grand in a year. Hard work, but it pays the bills." Bile rose in Natalie's throat. Pure, unfiltered terror washed over her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. "You have 24 hours, the man whispered, his breath hot against her face. "Tomorrow night, at the diner. We come to collect. If you don't have the cash, you come with us. If you scream, if you call the cops, we'll make sure you regret it for a very, very long time. Understand?" He shoved her backward. Natalie hit the floor hard, her head cracking against the lower cabinet. Stars exploded in her vision. The men didn't linger. They laughed quietly, stepping over the debris of her life, and walked out the door, leaving it hanging open on its broken hinges. Natalie lay on the floor for a long time, the silence of the destroyed apartment pressing down on her. The crushing weight of despair finally broke her. The defiance that had fueled her against Gabriel evaporated, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. She curled into a ball on the cold linoleum, staring at the scattered ashes of her mother, and wept until she had no tears left. There was no way out. The jaws of the trap had finally snapped shut, and she was entirely alone in the dark. The atmosphere inside the Starlight Diner was oppressively heavy, like the air right before a violent thunderstorm. It was 11:45 p.m. The dinner rush had cleared out, leaving only a few stragglers who nursed their coffees. Oblivious to the terror radiating from the waitress behind the counter, Natalie was a ghost. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow and ringed with dark shadows. She moved mechanically, wiping down the same spot on the counter for 5 minutes, her mind entirely consumed by the ticking clock in her head. Every time headlights swept across the diner windows, her breath caught in her throat. She had tried calling every relative, every distant friend she had, begging for a loan. She had been rejected by everyone. She had $74 in her pocket. It was a death sentence. At 11:55 p.m., the heavy glass door swung open. The bell chimed, a cheerful sound that felt like a funeral toll to Natalie. The 3 men from her apartment walked in. The leader, the pockmarked man they called the dentist, smiled. It was a cruel, predatory stretching of lips. He swaggered toward the counter, his massive enforcers flanking him, their eyes scanning the room, intimidating the remaining customers into quickly averting their gaze. Natalie's legs gave out. She grabbed the edge of the sink behind the counter to keep from collapsing, her knuckles turning white. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the diner seemed to be closing in on her. "Evening, sweetheart," the leader said, leaning heavily against the counter, right over the spot she had been cleaning. He tapped his thick fingers against the formica. "Time's up. Sal's waiting." "You got his money?" Natalie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She shook her head slowly, a single tear escaping and tracking down her bruised cheek. "That's a shame," the man sighed, his voice dropping the mock sweetness, turning instantly cold and professional. "Get your coat. We're going for a ride." "No," Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, I can't." The man reached across the counter, his massive hand shooting out to grab her by the wrist. His grip was agonizing, twisting her arm painfully. "I wasn't asking." Smash. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed like a gunshot through the diner. The leader froze, his grip on Natalie's wrist loosening in shock. He whipped his head toward the source of the noise. Sitting in the far corner booth, shrouded in the shadows, a man slowly stood up. He had been sitting there for an hour, entirely unnoticed, nursing a black coffee. He had just dropped his thick ceramic mug directly onto the floor, shattering it into dozens of pieces. Gabriel stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore a dark wool peacoat over a black turtleneck, making him look less like a businessman and more like a highly trained executioner. His face was an absolute mask of terrifying, lethal calm. He walked slowly down the aisle between the booths, his heavy boots making no sound on the floor. The three loan sharks turned to face him, their hands instinctively reaching inside their jackets. They were thugs, used to intimidating the weak. But as Gabriel stepped into the overhead light, recognition dawned on their faces. The leader's cocky swagger vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, sickly pallor. "Mr. Gabriel," the leader stammered, stepping away from the counter and releasing Natalie completely. His voice shook. We didn't know you were here, sir." "We're just collecting for Sal. Official business." Gabriel didn't look at them. He walked past the three massive men as if they were nothing more than inconvenient pieces of furniture. He stopped directly in front of the counter, looking down at Natalie. He saw the fresh bruise on her cheek, the terror in her eyes, the way she was shaking. A dark, terrifying storm brewed in his grey eyes, a violence so profound it made the air temperature drop. He finally turned his head to look at the leader. "Sal's business," Gabriel said softly, "is my business." "Yes, sir." The leader swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the drafty diner. "The girl owes 40 grand. We're just bringing her in to work it off. Orders." "The girl," Gabriel said, taking a slow step toward the man, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards, "owes nothing." The leader blinked, confused and terrified. "But, sir—" "The debt," I said, Gabriel interrupted, stepping so close that he towered over the thug. "She owes nothing. The debt is erased. Sal is to never speak her name, think her name, or walk down a street where she breathes. If I ever see your faces within a 10-mile radius of this diner or her apartment, I will personally ensure that your families receive you in very small, unmarked boxes." The silence that followed was absolute. The three enforcers stood frozen, the blood draining from their faces. They weren't dealing with a rival. They were dealing with the god of their underworld. And he had just pronounced a decree. "Do you understand me?" Gabriel whispered. "Yes, sir," the leader croaked, terrified to even make eye contact. "It's done. Debt is cleared. We're gone." Gabriel didn't say another word. He simply stared at them until they slowly backed away, turned, and practically sprinted out the front door, the bell jingling frantically in their wake. The diner was silent again. Gabriel turned back to the counter. Natalie was still clutching the sink, staring at him with a mixture of profound relief and a new, entirely different kind of terror. He had just saved her life, but he had done it by revealing the terrifying, absolute monster he truly was. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel asked, his voice losing the lethal edge, returning to a quiet, almost gentle tone. Natalie stared at him, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. The man who had humiliated her with a dollar bill had just shielded her from the wolves, but he was the king of the wolves. She slid down the front of the cabinets, collapsing onto the floor behind the counter, burying her face in her hands, and finally, completely, broke down. The diner's closed sign was flipped outward, the deadbolt thrown. The fluorescent lights had been shut off, leaving only the dim, amber glow of the emergency lights over the kitchen door and the ambient streetlight filtering through the blinds. Natalie sat in a booth near the back, a mug of lukewarm water wrapped in her trembling hands. Gabriel sat across from her. He had taken off his peacoat, looking strangely human in his dark turtleneck, though the aura of danger never fully left him. He had poured her the water, locked the doors, and sat in silence, waiting for the shock to subside. "Why?" Natalie finally spoke. Her voice was raspy, exhausted. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his gray ones. The terror had faded, replaced by a complex, swirling anger. "Why did you do that?" "You needed help," Gabriel said simply. "I didn't ask for your help," she snapped, a sudden spark of her old fire returning. She slammed her mug down on the table. "Do you think this makes you a hero? You sweep in and save the poor, helpless waitress from the big bad loan sharks?" Gabriel didn't flinch. He absorbed her anger quietly. "I think it makes you alive." "They work for you," Natalie cried, her voice cracking with indignation. "Don't sit there and act like a savior. Sal is your man. Those thugs who destroyed my apartment, who poured my mother's ashes on the floor, who threatened to sell me they only exist because you allow them to exist. You're the top of the pyramid. You're the reason the poison is in the water." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring out the window into the rainy night. For years, he had operated with a ruthless pragmatism. The people his syndicate hurt were statistics, acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of absolute power and order. He had insulated himself from the ground-level brutality. But hearing it from her, seeing the bruise on her cheek, knowing the terror she had endured, the insulation cracked. "I built an empire to ensure I would never be a victim again," Gabriel said, his voice unusually raw. He looked back at her, a rare vulnerability flashing in his eyes. "When I was young, the streets took everything from me. I swore I would become the monster, so no monster could ever touch me. I control the chaos." "You don't control it," Natalie argued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "You just organize it. You direct the suffering at people like me so you don't have to feel it yourself." The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. It was the most honest conversation Gabriel had engaged in for a decade. He was surrounded by sycophants, killers, and terrified subordinates. No one spoke the truth to him. No one dared. But this woman, with absolutely nothing to her name, sat across from him and dismantled the moral foundation of his entire life with a few sentences. "I cleared your debt," Gabriel finally said, changing the subject, unable to defend the indefensible. "You are free. Sal will never touch you. You can quit this place. Go back to school." "I don't want your charity," Natalie said firmly. "I told you that. I'll pay you back. Every penny." Gabriel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Natalie, it's $40,000. You can't pay that back." "Watch me," she replied, her chin jutting out with that familiar, stubborn pride. "I don't owe Sal anymore, but I owe you, and I will not be owned by a mafia boss. I'll work 3 jobs. I'll pay you $100 a month for the rest of my life if I have to, but I will not be your pet project." Gabriel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at her with a profound, unmasked admiration. She was beaten down, bruised, and exhausted, yet she possessed a strength he had never encountered in the boardrooms or the back alleys. She wasn't just surviving, she was fiercely protecting her soul. "I don't want your money," Gabriel said softly. "Then what do you want?" she demanded, exasperated. "Men like you don't do favors. There's always a price." "What is it?" Gabriel looked at her for a long time. He thought about the dollar bill in his pocket. He thought about the absolute emptiness of his penthouse suite, the paranoia that ruled his life, the bloody legacy he was building. He looked at the bruised, beautiful, fiercely proud woman sitting across from him, and he realized, with a terrifying clarity, exactly what he wanted. "I want you to show me," Gabriel said, his voice barely a whisper, "how you can look at the world, see how ugly and cruel it is, and still refuse to let it corrupt you. I want you to show me how you kept your dignity when everything else was stripped away." Natalie stared at him, stunned into silence. The predatory king of the underworld wasn't asking for submission, or money, or a favor. He was looking at her like a drowning man looking at a lighthouse. He was asking for redemption. Before she could form a reply, the heavy glass of the diner's front window exploded inward. The sound was deafening. A catastrophic shattering of thick glass, followed immediately by the rapid, staccato crack, crack, crack of automatic gunfire. Time seemed to slow down into microscopic fractions of a second. Gabriel didn't think. Instinct, honed by decades of violence, took over instantly. Before the first bullet even struck the vinyl of the booth, he was moving. He lunged across the table, grabbing Natalie by the shoulders, and viciously tackled her to the sticky floor, shielding her body entirely with his own. The diner disintegrated around them. The booths were shredded, stuffing and vinyl exploding into the air like macabre confetti. The coffee urns behind the counter ruptured, sending geysers of scalding liquid spraying across the room. The air instantly filled with the acrid burning smell of cordite and pulverized concrete. "Keep your head down!" Gabriel roared over the deafening noise, his heavy body pressing her flat against the floorboards. Natalie was paralyzed with terror, her hands covering her ears, screaming silently as the world ended above her. Shards of glass rained down on Gabriel's back, cutting into his coat. Gabriel's mind raced. This wasn't Sal. Sal wouldn't dare. This was an orchestrated hit, showing weakness, spending time alone in a diner, protecting a civilian, it had been noticed. A rival faction within his own syndicate, or perhaps an outside family, had seen a vulnerability and struck. He was isolated, without his guards, trapped in a glass box. The gunfire paused as the shooters outside reloaded. "Move!" Gabriel barked. He grabbed her arm, hauling her up into a low crouch, behind the kitchen counter. "Now!" They scrambled across the floor, slipping on spilled coffee and broken glass. Another volley of bullets ripped through the diner, just as they dove over the low wooden swinging door, crashing hard onto the greasy kitchen tiles. Heavy metal pots and pans absorbed the impacts above them, ringing out like chaotic church bells. Gabriel drew a heavy, matte black pistol from a concealed holster at the small of his back. He checked the magazine with terrifying efficiency. "Stay here," he ordered, his eyes locked onto the kitchen entrance. "Do not move until I come back for you." "Gabriel, no!" Natalie grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "There are too many of them." He looked down at her hand gripping his sleeve, then up at her face. In the midst of the gunfire and chaos, he offered her a tight, fierce smile. "I'm the monster. Remember? They should be running." He broke her grip and moved to the edge of the counter, peering out into the ruined dining area. Two men in dark clothes had stepped through the shattered front window, assault rifles raised, sweeping the room. Gabriel didn't hesitate. He stood up smoothly, his arm extended, and fired twice. Two deafening cracks echoed in the small space. Both men dropped instantly, neutralized with lethal, surgical precision. But there were more outside. Headlights flared from the street, and a heavy vehicle rammed the side of the diner, buckling the wall and sending a shower of plaster over the kitchen. "We can't stay here," Gabriel shouted, running back to Natalie. He grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. The back alley exit. "Go!" They ran through the cramped kitchen, navigating past the industrial ovens and deep fryers. Gabriel kicked open the heavy metal fire door, pushing Natalie out into the dark, rain-swept alley just as a fresh wave of bullets tore through the kitchen door behind them. The alley was narrow, filled with dumpsters and rotting garbage. "Run toward the avenue," Gabriel ordered, turning back to fire, suppressing shots into the diner. Natalie ran, her lungs burning, her worn shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. She looked back over her shoulder, just in time to see a third gunman emerge from the side alley, raising his weapon toward Gabriel's exposed back. "Gabriel! Behind you!" she screamed. Gabriel tried to pivot, but the wet ground betrayed him. He slipped, his shot going wide. The gunman smiled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Natalie didn't think. The sheer instinct to protect the man who had protected her overrode her terror. She grabbed a heavy metal trash can lid from the ground and hurled it with all her strength like a chaotic frisbee. It sailed through the rain and smashed directly into the gunman's face, throwing off his aim. The bullet struck the brick wall inches from Gabriel's head. Gabriel immediately recovered, firing a single fatal shot, neutralizing the threat. He turned to Natalie, chest heaving, his eyes wide with disbelief. She stood 20 feet away, shivering, her hands empty, having just saved the life of the most dangerous man in the city with a piece of garbage. The wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the night, approaching rapidly from all directions. The ambush was over. The surviving attackers would scatter. Gabriel walked slowly toward her, holstering his weapon. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his forehead, the rain washing the blood down his face. He stopped in front of her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them both completely exhausted, standing in a dirty alley behind the ruined remains of her livelihood. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly for the first time in his life, and gently wiped a streak of grease and plaster from her cheek. "You threw a trash can lid at a man with an assault rifle," Gabriel said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "He was going to shoot you," Natalie said simply, her breathing ragged. She looked up at him, the rain pasting her hair to her face. "I guess we're even now." Gabriel looked at her, truly seeing her. He didn't see a waitress. He didn't see a debtor. He saw an equal. He saw the only person in his entire violent world who had looked past the monster and decided he was worth saving. "No," Gabriel whispered, pulling her gently into his chest, wrapping his arms around her shivering frame to shield her from the cold. "We're just getting started." The morning sun broke through the heavy storm clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the wreckage of the Starlight Diner. Yellow police tape fluttered in the crisp breeze, cordoning off the shattered glass, bullet-pocked walls, and ruined booths. Gabriel stood on the sidewalk across the street, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his overcoat. He had spent the entire night securing his territory, ruthlessly rooting out the faction that had ordered the hit, and ensuring that no one, absolutely no one, would ever dare look in Natalie's direction again. He had consolidated his power, solidifying his reign as the undisputed king. But looking at the destroyed diner, the victory tasted like ash. He had won the war, but he was staring at the undeniable proof of his own toxicity. This was her world. This was where she earned her meager living, where she fought her quiet, desperate battles. And his presence had brought a hurricane of violence that destroyed it in seconds. He heard footsteps behind him. Natalie walked up, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from a bodega down the street. She was wearing a borrowed sweater, her arm bandaged where a piece of flying glass had grazed her. But she walked with a steady, grounded strength. She handed him a cup without a word and stood beside him, looking at the ruins. "I'm sorry," Gabriel said quietly, his eyes fixed on the collapsed neon sign. It was the first time in 20 years he had apologized to anyone. "I brought my world into yours. I destroyed your livelihood." Natalie took a sip of her coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. It was a terrible job anyway. The coffee tasted like battery acid, and the tips were horrible. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. "Especially from the mob bosses." Gabriel let out a short, surprised breath that was almost a laugh. He turned to face her, his expression turning serious. "I'm going to rebuild it," Gabriel said. "Better. You'll own the building, the land, everything. It will be yours, free and clear." Natalie shook her head slowly. "No, Gabriel. We talked about this. I don't want your money. I don't want blood money. It won't be blood money," Gabriel said, his voice firm, carrying a weight of absolute conviction. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the worn, coffee-stained $1 bill. He smoothed it out between his fingers. "When you slapped this on my chest," Gabriel continued, his eyes meeting hers, "you told me I was bankrupt inside. You were right. I spent my whole life building an empire of fear because I thought power was the only thing that could protect me. But standing in that alley last night, my power didn't save me. A woman with a trash can lid and a terrifying amount of courage saved me." He stepped closer to her. "I've ordered Marcus to begin liquidating the illegal operations, the loan sharking, the extortion, all of it. We are going legitimate. It will take time, and it will be dangerous. But the syndicate as it was is dead. I'm tearing it down." Natalie stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. The sheer magnitude of what he was saying was staggering. "Why?" she asked softly. Gabriel reached out, gently taking her free hand. His fingers were warm, his grip strong but incredibly gentle. "Because I want to live in a world where I don't have to destroy everything I touch. Because I want to be a man who is worthy of standing next to you. And because—" He paused, looking down at the dollar bill in his other hand. "I finally realize what true value looks like." He didn't hand the dollar bill back to her. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Keep it," Gabriel said softly, "as a reminder that a single act of defiance can change the entire world." Natalie looked down at her closed fist, feeling the texture of the old paper against her skin. She looked up at Gabriel, seeing past the scars and the tailored suit, seeing the man who was actively choosing to step out of the darkness. The road ahead would be chaotic, dangerous, and incredibly difficult for both of them. But as she squeezed his hand back, standing in the morning sun before the ruins of her old life, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. True power isn't found in wealth, fear, or the ability to dominate others. It resides in the unyielding strength of human dignity. Natalie's refusal to be humiliated, her courage to demand respect when she had nothing left to lose, didn't just save her own soul. It shattered the icy defenses of a man who ruled by terror, proving that a single spark of fierce integrity can illuminate even the darkest of empires. Never underestimate the ripple effect of standing up for yourself.